To this edition of the Global Eye, you're watching CNBC-TV18. I'm Archana Solanki. As the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors meeting in Bengaluru concludes, we get excerpts from our exclusive conversation with some important world leaders. First up, IMF Managing Director says that the world is likely to avoid a recession in 2023. She also says India is a bright spot for the world economy. Let's listen in.
I want to congratulate India and the Ministry of Finance Central Bank for excellent organization of the meetings and for creating the atmosphere to build consensus. One Earth, one family, one future. And this is the spirit of the meetings. On debt restructuring, while there are still some disagreements, we now have a global sovereign debt roundtable with participation of all public and private creditors and of debtor countries. We just finished a session in which it is clear that there is commitment to bridge differences for the benefit of countries that depend on that. On the global financial architecture, a recognition that in the world we live that is more shock-prone, we need each other, we have to overcome divisions, and despite of the fragmentation that we are facing, we can do that when there is political will.
There has been a lot of concern about the resilience of the global economy, the shocks that are in store. What did you warn G20 leaders about as far as the state of economy and what lies ahead?
The message we come with is we have found resilience over the last years, but we also recognize that 2023 is going to be a challenging year. Why? Because global growth is slowing down. At the same time, there are signs that it may be a turning point with growth bottoming out and inflation finally trimming down. We are most concerned about uncertainties. The war in Ukraine is a grave source of uncertainty, but so are other factors. In 2022, there were natural disasters on all continents. We started this year with the tragedy in Turkey and Syria. In this environment, we have to recognize that we have to learn to think of the unthinkable.
There is a lot of concerns about cryptocurrencies where you don't know who the issuer is. How should the G20 approach this issue? Everyone is waiting for some sort of global framework. Should we be moving towards a ban or regulations?
The IMF just days ago discussed this issue at our board, and what the conclusion is, first, crypto assets are not money. They cannot be accepted as a legal tender. Second, there has to be very strong push for regulation. And third, if regulation fails, so if we are slow to do it, then we should not take off the table banning those assets because they may create financial stability risk.
Right. And finally, will the world be able to avoid a recession this year?
It looks like we will avoid recession. There will be countries that are in negative territory, but global recession is less likely. Why? Three reasons. One, we were surprised by the resilience of labor markets in many economies, in the United States, in Europe, and the resilience of consumer spending. Two, we have been quite impressed by how quickly Europe managed to free itself from dependency on Russian oil and gas. Mother Nature helped. The winter was milder this year, but that allowed the European economies, many of them, to avoid recession. Not all of them, but many of them. And three, China took a decision to open up, and that is creating a new impetus for growth in China. India is a bright spot on the global scene. Actually, India is contributing 15% of global growth this year. So thank you, India.
So finally, you're in India. Any recommendations for the Indian government to have a higher growth path?
What India can do more of is to continue on that path of structural reforms and to work even harder on more inclusiveness. And I see that this is being embraced by India.
And the war becomes the biggest threat. Everyone here has said this is the biggest threat to the global economy. Do you think that could create more supply shocks?
It is very uncertain how the war is going to evolve, and as long as this uncertainty is with us, it can make especially energy markets anxious. What we all pray is for peace, not only for the people of Ukraine that have suffered so much, but also for more calm in the world economy.
The Netherlands finance minister says that not repeating the Bali text on Russia's invasion of Ukraine would be a reversal of the leaders' agreement and would be unacceptable. Let's listen in.
Fundamental issue is the adherence and repeat of the language that was agreed by the leaders at the G20 in Bali, where there's a very firm statement on Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And for us and many of our allies, it's unacceptable that this language is not repeated or adhered to. It would mean a reversal of a very clear statement by the leaders at the highest level.
Right. Is there also an attempt by India, by the G7, to have a stronger text on the Ukraine war, a stronger condemnation of Russia, naming Russia as an aggressor?
Well, I think the Indian presidency is, of course, trying to channel and guide the process in an appropriate manner, as one would expect of any president. And my compliments, of course, to India in that regard. But we need to be very firm on calling a spade a spade. And we've done so repeatedly, and we think it's important to do this again. Many of the issues we deal with today, the food insecurity, the hike in energy prices, are a direct resultant from the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine and the continued warfare on Ukraine. So to pretend and to meet at the level of ministers of finance, to talk about the world's issues and pretend as if this is not a real factor driving a lot of the conditions we face today, many of the countries in the world would be remiss.
Let me ask you about the issue of climate finance. We have been discussing this at different COP meetings. Has there been any way forward, any kind of agreement with different finance ministers on how we need to approach this in future, what kind of commitments we need to make at the G20?
Well, I think this is a very important aspect that you name. And I have to mention as well, together with Indonesia, the Netherlands will be the incoming co-chair of a broad group of ministers of finance committed to climate action. So this meeting for me was very important too, to showcase what could be done, how green finance needs to be supported, how we need to mobilize private sector investment and engagement, and how we need to use our fiscal rules and policies in order to encourage green financing to accelerate the energy transition that is important for advanced economies and developing countries. And of course we need to find a balance, and as advanced economies through and with the IMF and the World Bank, we need to support other countries in order to enable this transition for its citizens, because not all of us have deep pockets, so to speak.
Right. On the issue of debt restructuring,
yes,
we believe that this is also a contentious issue at the G20, how to apply the common framework on debt resolution, what countries like China need to do over here. Has there been any positive response from China?
Well, I think this is an ongoing debate. Ultimately, what's very important is that we assist countries with their state of indebtedness, that we help them address it, because it's a source of instability, it's a source of concern to many countries, and it's not just affecting lower income countries, it's also affecting middle income countries. So for the Netherlands, we'd like there to be a greater space for middle income countries to be supported under the common framework, which currently is not yet the case. Right. Equally so, we think transparency and greater cooperation between public and private creditors is very important. So we really assist the countries to deal with their level of indebtedness, because it's really a threat. And on top of high energy prices, on top of the hike in food prices, this actually is a fundamental issue of concern to many countries and its citizens.
Now, when it comes to sending out a message to India, you've had bilateral discussions with other finance ministers here, with Finance Minister Sitaraman as well. What has been your message to the Indian government as to what you would like to see achieved at the G20 presidency?
Well, I think the Indian presidency has set forth an ambitious agenda from a very independent and strong viewpoint. What we'd like to achieve is, of course, the discussions that we've started also today. It's one of the first meetings of the G20 ministers, I believe the first. Green financing, to have clarity on the energy transition. Naturally, we need to remain firm on Ukraine and resolution to the Ukraine war, but also international commitment to Ukraine, and equally so, consider the views when it comes to solutions and dealing with issues of growth, green and inclusive growth for the countries of the global south. This is a global commitment, and the G20 has a key primordial role, and we hope that we can achieve great progress, and I'm very convinced of this year under the Indian presidency. And the Netherlands is invited as a guest. So we're grateful to be here, to contribute to the debate, and also offer, where it's appropriate, our expertise in matters of finance, green finance, and international cooperation. So we hope this will be useful to the overall debate and the conclusions.
Right. And finally, there's a lot of conversation going on reform of multilateral development banks. What are the key reforms that are being sought by leaders?
Well, what we'd like to see, the Netherlands certainly, is to see the international financial institutions be more risk-embracing, to really review their capital frameworks, and of course to be even firmer and more forward-leaning on issues of climate change, but with that also biodiversity.
On that note, it's time for a short break, but from the sidelines of the G20 summit, more interesting conversations are lined up on the other side. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the special edition of The Global Eye. Ritu Singh caught up with the Chief Economic Advisor, Anantha Nageswaran, on the sidelines of the G20's first meeting of finance ministers and central bank governors. She began by asking him about the key priorities taken up during the discussions on the first day of the meeting.
The priorities are taken up based on the different working groups. So obviously morning the focus was on international financial architecture and sustainable finance working groups. Okay. So those were the two working group related topics that were covered.
There's been a lot of talk about debt sustainability and debt distress that some of the lower middle income countries find themselves in. Any dialogue on that front, specifically with regards to certain select countries that are facing duress?
It's not, the specific countries are not taken up in particular or in detail in the G20. In G20, it's about establishing the framework and the process of establishing debt sustainability. So we have the common framework which the G20 in 2021 came up with, and it's now about implementing it and ironing out the wrinkles, and that is what the G20 process was focused on. Yeah.
The UN recently said that developed countries, the G20 countries, need to step up their financing towards sustainable development goals by an additional $500 billion each year. Any, conversation on that front as well today?
Well, obviously, we all know about the financing pledges for SDGs, which also include climate. At the same time, we know that no matter how much of public funds are pledged, it won't be adequate. We need all sources of funding. And MDBs can play a part not only in providing direct financing, but also through de-risking and being able to attract private sector funding in that process. Yeah.
But was there any agreement of any additional, financing?
That is not something that you will arrive at in one session. Right now it's about the finance ministers and central bank governors agreeing with the priorities of the presidency. This is the first FMCBG ministerial meeting of the Indian presidency. So agreements will come in the course of the presidency here.
One quick question, sir, on cryptocurrency, since there is going to be a dialogue. Again, want to reiterate, while nothing is expected to come out of a two-day meeting, but what is the direction of the conversation?
IMF has come up with a note for the paper for the ministers to consider, and then on an ongoing basis, FSB is working on it. So it's important that we look at both the cross-border regulatory aspects, macro-financial implications, etc. So there again, it is a work in progress.
Right, moving on from the sidelines of the G20 meeting, my colleague Ritu Singh caught up with UNDP Administrator Achim Steiner and began by asking on the light of global uncertainties, inflation, recession fears in some of the largest economies. Now, what role can G20 play and what could India's leadership mean at a time like this? Listen in.
Well, first of all, if you go back in history, the G20 was always set up as a kind of crisis response mechanism, initially meant to bring the leading economies that account for almost 80% of the world's economy together around the table, despite their political differences, to help stabilize global economic crisis. Well, here we are in the beginning of 2023, and as you just described, coming out of a pandemic, finding ourselves in an economic crisis, a debt crisis that is also unfolding, and a cost of living crisis, and a lot of conflict around the world. So here in Bengaluru, the finance ministers, central bank governors are a key track of the G20 process, and obviously they are addressing themselves particularly to the issue of financial and economic crisis, finding answers to the debt issues, and that is at the core of what is being discussed here, and will then find its way back into the summit later in the year, but also into the annual or the spring meetings rather of the IMF and the World Bank, for instance.
Debt sustainability, like you said, that is one of the issues or priorities that has been set by India during this G20 discussion, along with others, including the role of multilateral development institutions, building sustainable cities of the future. What do you make of these priorities that have been set? What UN have liked to see more?
Well, first of all, I think the world has welcomed India's G20 presidency agenda because it is in many ways signaling an inclusive agenda. I think all the members of the G20 find within this broad spectrum of issues key priorities that they would like to focus on. Secondly, they also reflect the seriousness of issues that need to be addressed right now, whether it is the debt crisis, and let us remember there are over 52 developing countries right now that are essentially one step away from being in debt distress. That means possibly going to default. That's a large number of countries. We are also looking at the continuing increase in interest rates. So the problem is not going to go away. It needs a solution. We need restructuring, rescheduling of debt. That's precisely where the G20 can bring countries together in order to agree on the principal direction. But also the strong focus on development, and with India being the presidency and bringing a developing country focus in an inclusive sense of the word, namely the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda. They were signed by all countries around the world. They're a shared agenda for development. Also, that is finding its way to the center of the summit, and I think that is bringing countries around the table.
Okay, those are some of the issues I'd like to talk about, starting with debt sustainability. You said these 50 low and middle income developing countries are at the verge of a debt distress. And we know that the United Nations has proposed a restructuring or a refinancing of sort. What has been the response here from the large countries participating in the G20?
Well, the Secretary General last week released an SDG stimulus plan, as he calls it, which is essentially a call, particularly also aiming at the G20 nations, the G7, so to speak, plus emerging economies, to look at three things: how to inject liquidity into the world's economy, because after the pandemic and with many countries being fiscally now constrained, this is a big problem. Secondly, to address the debt issue through rescheduling and restructuring, because, just to give you one example, 25 countries today, developing countries, are paying more than 20%
of their revenues,
of their GDP on just servicing their debt. This is not sustainable, and I could give you many more warning light indicators, which are precisely why the finance ministers are now paying far greater attention to this issue and looking for ways forward. And thirdly, to also address the longer term cost of borrowing, because we are in a significant period of transition of economic recovery. Countries need access to affordable capital.
And have countries here been amenable to the idea of restructuring the debt for some of these, the poorest of the countries?
I think there is a growing recognition that it is precisely a mix of instruments that will be needed. Certainly, there is also discussion happening about the international financial architecture, particularly international financial institutions. How can they, for example, leverage their balance sheets to a great extent to lend more money with paid-in capital? Should there be more paid-in capital so they can lend more, particularly also against the backdrop of the current crisis, but also the challenge of climate change?
Yeah, and speaking of climate change, I think UN again has said that developed countries need at least $500 billion more annually to support these SDGs. What's the dialogue been like?
Well, let me just be very clear that the $500 billion that the Secretary General associates with the stimulus plan first of all, is across the spectrum of development priorities and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. What is also important to note is that in the way that the proposals are being developed, it does not mean that taxpayers in certain countries have to pay more. It is about leveraging balance sheets better. It is about lowering the cost of borrowing. UNDP has calculated in a subsequent paper released just this week that we could save for developing countries $120 to $140 billion by restructuring debt and by allocating debt through the channels of multilateral lending, which will bring their interest rates down from 12-14% to 4%. That is a core function of the international development banks.
And with that, it's a wrap on this special show. Thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned for more news and updates.